Everybody. Oh, perfect. So my first page was replaced because my face is, oh my God, okay. I was hoping that that was not going to make it to it, but there's my face. Quickly for you guys, part of Trident Capital Cybersecurity. I am a founding investor and principal at the fund. Personally, I've invested over $100 million in over 15 security companies. Quickly about us, we're a $310 million security fund. We have a 6-person investing team. And currently in our first fund, which we started in 2015, we've invested in 11 portfolio companies. So we can move on to the next slide. I don't know how to change it. Is it this one over here? Green button? Green button. Thank you very much. So question all of you have, usually when we talk about trends, is investing at a peak. Obviously as part of this slide, I'm saying we are at a peak. I wouldn't say that we are at the peak. It's almost impossible to call what the top looks like. But in several metrics, we're at the top, right? In terms of customers, we're at the top in terms of the budget within cybersecurity. We're at the top in terms of number of acquisitions being done per year. Alon's speak was very fascinating because he was talking about in the cybersecurity sense in Israel, while I'm talking about it globally. Globally, we've had a peak number of acquisitions. The number of public investors investing in cybersecurity is also at a peak. We have, in terms of number of security companies, as well as the number of market cap in these companies. And lastly, I'm a venture capitalist. I'm a private investor. We're at the peak in terms of number of dollars deployed in cyber, as well as number of security companies. Before we go this, we're going to go do four personas. Everyone's an investor. A customer is an investor, an acquirer is an investor, a public hedge fund is an investor, and so is a private company is an investor. Customers, don't need to speak too much about this because you guys all read this in the news, Facebook, Uber. There's a lot of focus on this. And what we've seen in the past couple of years is that there's more C-suite attention into cybersecurity. And what that does, it creates budgets. The board level, the CEOs create budgets and allow people underneath to do their job. So what we've seen overall is an increase in budgets. It's been a consistent 4 to 12% increase per year since 2015, depending on who you talk to. And then we've also seen a big dramatic shift in terms of number of companies victimized by cybersecurity. In the past, no one would admit that they were victimized by cybersecurity. Now it's more common. 77% of companies last year said that they were attacked and successfully. In 2014, 60% of companies said that they're optimistic and that they could prevent a cyber attack. Now it's down to 38%. So overall, customers find the need to invest, and we're at a peak there. Next, talk about acquirers. Acquirers, also investors. What do we see acquirers doing? What do we see them paying? Why are they doing what they're doing? This is great data from Momentum Cyber, and where we see that right now we're at the peak in terms of number of acquisitions, 178 versus 177. I'll talk very quickly about the years and trends per year very quickly in the future. In terms of exits, we saw that a lot of exits in 2016 was mostly towards IPOs, into public companies, while the number of dollars going into private companies has actually decreased, which is an interesting piece to figure out. What we're sort of seeing now is that the number of strategic acquisitions, so we've seen 3 big ones that's happened on the strategic side recently, Evident.io, which just came out very recently, Phantom Cyber by Splunk, and then also another one that's very similar in terms of the strategic multiple and exit size is Science, acquired in the cyber insurance space. And then lastly, opportunistic. The multiples vary depending on the small size of the company, and then we'll go from there. Now, what do public companies investors look for? Overall, they're still looking for growth. In 2015, all public investors looked for primarily was growth at the expense of cost. Now what we're seeing is we're sort of a middle ground. They look at both growth as well as amount of cash spent. One thing that's really interesting on the public market, and especially in security, is that 2015 was a de facto peak in cybersecurity. That's where we saw high teens multiples from the biggest companies, from companies like FireEye. 2016, we saw a dramatic shift or drop in valuation. About half of that or more was dropped from 2016. In 2017, we're starting to see an increase from 2017. I used to say that 2015 was a peak and 2017 we still have 50% more to grow. But with Zscaler recently coming out and hitting 20x forward revenue, I think we are reaching another valuation peak on the public side as well. And then comparing that to security, to software companies as a whole, cybersecurity had its peak in 2015. Public companies had their peak in 2014. This metric is showing companies that have grown at least 20% on the public side. Back in 2014, 12x EV to NTM revenue was the norm. Now we're at around 9 times. So if you want to compare where we are today versus the peak in 2014, we have about 3 more turns to go in terms of valuation. Next, now we're moving on to the stuff that I'm more interested in, which is the private side. In terms of the amount of funding, we're at a peak by far. I mean, there's no other way of saying that cybersecurity is a very hot area. In terms of number of deals, also at the peak there. The interesting thing to talk about next, though, is why. Why is that happening? Why do we have so many deals? Why do we have so much cash going into these cybersecurity companies on the private side? And one reason could be the number of first-time investors in cybersecurity. This is a great data from CB Insights. 2017, we've had our absolute maximum in terms of first-time investors in cybersecurity. These are people who did not do a deal in 2016, 2015, and then they chose to do their first deal in cybersecurity after a long period or never invest in the past in 2017. So not only do we have record number of deals, record number of capital, we also have record number of investors in cybersecurity as of 2017. Where is this money going? Alon talked about this on the Israeli side. It's being mirrored globally as well, and as well as in the United States. Majority of the capital is going towards the later stage companies. And, when you think about venture capital, how do you scale investment? How do you invest a bunch of capital? You invest in later stage investments. Now, this is a trend piece that we talk about 4 different personas and 4 different investors. And all these investors think about things in a slightly different way. One theme that a lot of people do know of is the Gartner hype cycle. So when you think about, what does a seed company look like? What does a Series A company look like? What does a Series B company look like? What does a public company look like? We generally, and a lot of people will argue with me on this one, we generally view these different parts of that Gartner hype cycle correspond to these different series. So the pre-seed and the Series A, those are the most exciting parts of the company. That's when a lot of people are talking about a lot of excitement. When all that money is going into these companies and all of them are funded at high valuations with lots of budget after the Series A, that's when a lot of people will sit and wait. And while we're sitting and waiting, we don't know what's going on because you learn the most about a company when they're fundraising. When they're fundraising, they tell you everything and anything, right? They tell you their vision, they tell you how much budget they have, they tell you how many people they want to hire. But once they get that money, they go into hermit mode, they don't tell you what's going on. And so that's when we start seeing a decrease in expectations because we just don't know what's going on. And then what we'll see is a lot of companies will die at that stage. As they're going down, they'll just continue going down and then they won't exist anymore. But then some companies will surprise us. And so that's when we start seeing the slight increase. When that slight increase starts to happen, that's when the business model is proven, product market fit is proven, they've hired a bunch of people, they've hired salespeople, they have a solid team, and that's when the Series C and later starts coming to the picture. That's when you start seeing $50 million checks, $100 million checks going to cybersecurity companies. Now, last of all, some major industry themes. One thing to think about in cybersecurity is that cybersecurity is very recursive. It happens over and over and over again. We started with mainframe in terms of computing. After mainframe, we had personal computing where everyone had their own computer. We had internet, we had mobile, we have IoT, we have cloud. Every time there's a big shift in compute, all those security controls that we're used to gets repeated over and over again. So when we had mainframes, we had endpoint security. A lot of security back in the endpoint days was more or less physical security because we were preventing people from actually physically accessing those computers. Then we had personal computing where we started having firewalls. So what we see is these controls repeat themselves over and over again whenever there's a big industry shift. So these are the current trends right now because we're in the world of cloud. We're transitioning more and more to the cloud. We're in the world of IoT. We're in the world of data. So for instance, insurance, very, very heavily dependent on data. And for the first time in a very, very long time, we're getting more and more comfort with the data that we do have that we're able to access. The issue is we don't have enough historical data to create underwriting models yet. So that's why we need to start investing in insurance. Deception is a brand new market. It didn't really exist back in the past. Although if you think about the art of war, it's always been around. Threat intelligence has been around for a very long time, hybrid cloud security. So these are just some industry trends that are relevant today, depending on where you are, whether you are an acquirer, whether you are a public company investor, whether you're a private company investor. These are some things you can look at towards the future. All right. Thank you, guys.